Good.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. We're really happy to be here. I'm going to, I guess I changed my slide. So I will just go ahead and dive right into this. I have the objectives here. I'm not going to read them. I know these were included in the description when you all applied. What I do want to say is I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Casa de Esperanza and the National Latino Network, which is a little confusing at times. Casa de Esperanza began as a local shelter-based organization. Really work evolved and expanded, and once we started listening to Latinas, they realized that shelter was a kind of a very small piece of what Latinas needed, and so the organization really expanded to do a lot more community engagement and family advocacy and work in a lot of areas that Latinas wanted and needed and asked for. And as time went on, we also eventually became a national organization, first receiving a grant from OVW that kind of started that work, and then eventually getting the big national grant to be the National Latino Resource Center on Domestic Violence, which really was a big springboard. At this point in time now, we are basically the primary TA provider for both HHS and OVW on issues related to violence against women in Latino communities. And so the Casa de Esperanza, the National Latino Network, is the umbrella under which we do our national work. Our headquarters is in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where we still operate a small shelter and have a local community-based program that we're still very much a part of. However, the national work is done all over the country. Our staff work in, I wish I could tell you right now how many states, but we keep growing. We have we have 17 national staff, and they work remotely all over the country. And so that's where that's why it appears that there's two organizations, but we did send you the websites for both because we don't want there to be any confusion. So anyways, with that, we'll just get started. I believe you got some information on us. If anybody wants any kind of biographical information, you can request that from us later. So I'll just go ahead and get started because we're trying to really go over a lot of information in a very, very, very short amount of time, and hopefully we can do this well. But we want to start basically by, it's really important that we really have a good idea of who we're talking about, because, this is the information from the U.S. Census, the most current one, which was done in 2014, actually. A lot of times you'll see the 2010 numbers. But Latinos at this point make up 17% of the population in the United States. And of that 17%, the largest percentage of Latinos are Mexican Americans who are Mexican descent, who are 64% of the population, with Puerto Ricans not that close at 10%. The top 5 states by Hispanic population census were California, followed by Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. However, the 5 states with the fastest growing Hispanic populations were first Tennessee, which increased by 163%, South Carolina, Alabama, Kentucky, and South Dakota, which still saw an increase of 132%. The 5 states where Hispanics make up the biggest share of the population, the biggest percentage of the population, are New Mexico, which their Hispanic population is 47%, California at 38, Texas at 38, Arizona at 30, and Nevada at 27. So in case some of you on the calls are from some of those states, I thought that might be of interest to you. The Hispanic population, I also want to give you an idea. We're kind of going to break it down here really quickly so you can kind of get a picture for who we're talking about. Of the 55.4 million people, 35.9 million or 65% of those Latinos are native U.S.-born Latinos. And 19.5 million, 35% of those are foreign-born. So, and by native-born, we mean anybody who is a U.S. citizen at birth, who was born in the United States, who was born in Puerto Rico or in island areas of Guam, or who may have been born abroad but to U.S. citizen parents, And then when we are talking about the foreign-born, that would include anyone who's not a U.S. citizen at birth, who was a naturalized U.S. citizen, who are legal permanent residents, who are temporary migrants or humanitarian migrants, or they could be unauthorized immigrants as well. And so we want to kind of give you a picture of that segment of what we're talking about as well. I have a somewhat of a breakdown. I don't have a visual of the breakdown of the Latino specific, but I do have some numbers within this. The chart you're seeing right now represents the total foreign population in the U.S. So that's total of all races and ethnicities combined. And so of the 42 million people, immigrants represented in the U.S. in this chart, 52% of those are Latina or Latinos. And 28% of that 52%, 28% of those are from Mexico, and 24% are from other Latin American countries. So more than half of all of the people represented in this chart are Latinos. Of all immigrants combined, approximately 42% are naturalized citizens, and 27% are legal permanent residents. 4.5 of foreign-born residents are temporary legal residents, such as like students, for example. Unauthorized immigrants, which is kind of the population that we hear most about when we are talking, not when we are, but when we hear others talking about Latinos, they tend to really be talking about that very small segment of immigrants who do make up about a quarter of the foreign-born population. As far as, just to give you a picture of this number here of the 11.2 million, the number of unauthorized Mexican immigrants, which is one number that I have that is represented here, was 5.9 million. So of the 11.2 unauthorized immigrants that you do see represented here, 52% of those are of Mexican heritage. So let's talk a little bit about, I had a slide on children. Did I just skip right over it? Somehow it's missing. Okay, so basically I want to talk a little bit, because we are talking about children here. And so I do want to tell you a little bit. I apologize that that slide is not there. Basically, when we're talking about, it's going to be hard, I guess, without a picture, but 51% of Latino children are second-generation native-born of at least one foreign-born parent. I think that's probably one of the most important. Of all children of Latino descent that are represented in the census under 18 years old, 38% of those children are native-born to native parents. And then the 51.7% that I talked about, they have either one or two unauthorized parents. And then you have about 4% that are foreign-born naturalized citizens or permanent residents, and then you have about 7% that are unauthorized, children that are unauthorized. So I know, I'm sorry I had to go through that really quickly, but I really wanted you to kind of have a little bit of a perspective and frame for kind of who we're talking about here and how big this segment of the population is. Because one of the reasons we do this, I mean, it's a really important issue. A lot of attention isn't spent on this at times, but we just kind of wanted to point out why it's so important. Obviously, this demonstrates how important it is so that we can continue to respond to these ever-evolving demographics. We care about this because we want to improve the qualities of services, which a lot of times are assumed that because we do a particular thing that we serve everyone, and oftentimes we don't. We want to eliminate these long-standing disparities that exist, probably which many of you are already aware of because you found it obviously important enough to come and find out more in this particular topic. The idea of culture is It permeates everything we do, specifically and most importantly, it influences our assessment accuracy. Right now also, there's an increasing demand. If you're applying for grant funding, that will be one of those things that you can get docked on, or maybe not be as competitive as others who are working in a more culturally responsive way. And also because without knowing who we are serving, we are not going to be able to remove those additional access barriers that this population may have. We won't be able to identify the needs that they have. We can't, create effective opportunities that are going to serve them and create better outcomes, and we won't be able to promote safety. So most importantly to me, I think, this idea of why we should care about culture, all those things are very important, but really culture just defines the lives of women, children, communities, tribes, of our agencies, of our work when we're doing domestic violence, of all of our agencies. And so that really is kind of one of the things that makes it most important. So we want to just stop here for a second, only because in order to present the information in the time that we have allotted, we're having to do a couple of things that are not really very ideal. And one of them is that to some degree we have to kind of assume a certain level of, I want to say, cultural capacity of the participants on the call. And in a way we also have to, we generalize quite a bit about the Latino population. And in regards to the assumptions around the level of knowledge that people have around culture and the concept that's most often referred to as cultural competence, we kind of have learned from experience, and I'm sure you have as well, that it tends to be a bad idea to assume that people kind of share a common understanding of what that is. And so it's going to be important. We are going to have to spend a little bit of time on that, but it's going to be quite abridged. And we really strongly suggest that you, if you haven't already, that you spend some time really focusing on understanding the concept of what's called cultural competence. I'll use another term, but that's how it's defined most of the time out in the world. But one point that we want to make now is that, I'll use the term cultural capacity to reflect, to deflect that, because it's debated. Cultural competence suggests that you somehow arrive at a point and you're actually competent at some point, but I'll use cultural competency to indicate one's kind of lifelong process and journey towards becoming more culturally responsive. Unless the source that I reference uses otherwise, that's just the term that you'll find me using. In regards to this idea that we'll be generalizing quite a bit about Latinas, we are particularly concerned about this because there is a danger in sharing general knowledge about a population, as it can be misinterpreted or misused. It can sometimes, perpetuate, kind of encourage prejudgment or stereotypes or discrimination. And it's one of those kind of paradigms, conflicting paradigms that we have to kind of deal with, because in order to provide this information, it's necessary for us to generalize so that you can be more aware of these possibilities, and that's why we kind of want to start with this basic understanding of cultural competence, because without it, it's more likely that the information will be misused or misunderstood, or used in a way that it's not intended, or generalized in a way, overgeneralized in a way that it shouldn't be. So just to kind of get us past this little place where we're doing this, we want to just define a couple of terms that we think are important to kind of make the distinction with this. We want to define a few terms, because generalizing it's at the bottom of the screen here. That's kind of what we're trying to do, and I want to make a distinction. So when we talk about prejudice involves prejudging people without taking any time to obtain the adequate information or to develop an opinion fairly. And prejudice usually involves belief. And when you talk about stereotyping, that typically involves values. And it's where you create a standardized mental image. It's based on limited experience, and you just decide, an entire group is that way. And then discrimination is when you get to the point where you're actually involving actual behaviors, where you're treating people differently or negatively because of specific culture or diversity characteristic or some other thing. So I keep using the word generalizing. We will be doing a lot of generalizing. And when you generalize, to infer a general principle or to share a trend from a particular set of facts or statistics or the like. And so I just kind of wanted to make sure that we had that that distinction. It's really important, however, that we limit generalizing can turn into overgeneralizing when one forms a general opinion or conclusion from a few facts or examples, or assumes and then assumes it's kind of the case for all because they learned this and that's how this community is, and then it just becomes stereotyping. So that's just a kind of word of caution I wanted to put out there, that as we put this out there, that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind. So to set that foundation, let's talk a little bit about just culture, so we kind of all have at least some degree of a general understanding. So basically, there's a lot of times people think of culture. It's kind of an outdated definition that we think of, that it's a kind of a real static, stable pattern of beliefs and values and thoughts and customs, and that's just passed on from generation to generation. However, in throughout the last several decades, even 2 or 3 decades, that has really evolved quite a bit, and the definition of culture has evolved to really give you a much more critical definition of culture, where it's now seen as referring to shared experiences or commonalities that have developed and continue to evolve based on many dimensions of diversity. And I apologize, I know this is possibly a little bit small here, but in the center here what you'll see is the dimensions of diversity that are in a way considered the primary dimensions. They're those that are not a choice, that are not seen as a choice. And then the second dimension here, the middle kind of layer, what they call the secondary dimensions, those are more fluid and they can change. And there's stuff like your marital status, your work experience, your education, the language that you speak, those kinds of dimensions. And then of course we have this outer layer that a lot of times is that layer that is most ignored than any of the others, where you bring in this degree of acculturation, which we won't be talking much about. What we did include a handout for you to kind of understand that, how that operates, and then our people's origins, roots, and the historical context of their oppression. So in all cultures, contexts of privilege and access are created by certain norms against which all other subgroups are compared. And so in the U.S., the attributes of the dominant culture include, for example, English as a primary language, whiteness, Christianity, physically able, male, economically resourced, heterosexual, those kinds of things. And each of those gives you a different set of privileges. And privileges and access arise from having, right, the more you have, the more privilege and access you have. And what can occur with privilege, it includes in a way also not having to recognize one's own culture as the norm. Not to have to think about access to resources or connections and status. And the problem with this being that privileges for one group can create the dynamics of oppression, right, of domination, or the cycle of oppression. So that's another thing that we really don't have a lot of time to get into, but we really encourage you to learn more about the cycle of oppression, as it's really central to gaining perspective of these cultural contexts. But like I said, since we're having to go through this quickly, how we basically are defining, how we basically look at culture then is, where we're kind of landing, is culture is then the learned and shared knowledge, beliefs, and rules that people use to interpret experience and to generate social behavior. The guiding force behind the behaviors and material products, it's everything associated with a group of people. And it's really important that we kind of understand this, that culture defines us as individuals, that organizations have cultures, that it's really important that we all have cultures, because a lot of times we see culture as something that someone else has. But it's a really important concept to understand, because meaning is assigned. A lot of times it's not something that, it's like we look at a behavior and we interpret what interpret other people and what is happening through our own cultural filter of what our own culture tells us is happening. And that's another reason why being aware and understanding all those privileges becomes so important, because you have to, the more aware you are of yourself, the more you're able to see the exchange and the relationship, as opposed to just having your own lens. I'm going to go forward here. And this is actually hopefully this doesn't offend anyone, but this is a comic that, to me, really, that idea of seeing things in your own worldview. I find this interesting that, one will see everything's covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. Where the other sees it, nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. And that really kind of gets to that point about meaning being assigned, and that we view the world through our own cultural context. And the more awareness we have about our own cultural context, the better we are, the better our cultural capacity is to then help and assist others. Yeah, I remember in a discussion, I've been in several discussions where there's this discussion of female genital mutilation, for example, and in America we can see that through our own cultural lens. It's such a horrible, obviously it's just a terrible thing. In America, though, the sexualization and exploitation of women for the gratification of men is a concept that's very ingrained in our American culture. But sometimes we don't see it that way from the inside. I had a friend one time that was kind of doing an analogy of these and saying, American women, they mutilate themselves by cutting open their chests and implanting foreign objects to increase their bust size. They take fat from their derriere and put it in to plump their lips, and they, inject paralyzing drugs into their, foreheads to reduce wrinkles. And here in America, these practices seem quite normal. However, we can see that it's kind of this same paradigm that, it's kind of like sometimes you can't see the forest through the trees, but it sometimes, can have a different, those ideas can be seen differently elsewhere. And so that's why I kind of put all this out there, just to kind of give you that perspective and understanding that that exists, and kind of to be aware of that. So we have this foundation as we start talking about these other kind of views that I'm going to be sharing. So really important, like I said, cultural capacity, or what others call cultural competency, it does not mean knowing everything about a culture. Sometimes people think, oh, if I can, learn everything about this culture, then I'll be competent. And it's actually quite different than that. It actually is an awareness of yourself. It's like you're aware of your own culture and your biases and what you bring to those situations. That's kind of that. And it involves having a willingness to learn and accept that there are many ways of viewing the world, and and recognizing and rejecting pre-existing beliefs that we have, and instead focusing on comprehending the information that we have based on the event that we're a part of, the context at hand, whatever it is that we happen to be working on at that particular time. It involves both individual and institutional practice. There's certain things we can do as individuals, but we're still within organizations that have other capacity issues beyond those personal individual ones. And then you have structural ones, right, that involve, but it's kind of increasing your knowledge and capacity on that. It's characterized by an acceptance and respect for difference, and it requires continuous self-assessment. This idea that you're never actually done. It's a journey. It's something that you just keep growing and learning. It involves being aware of our own biases, prejudices, recognizing our professional power. And this is one of those ones that gets really difficult, because a lot of times we can recognize it and be aware of it, but that's we don't necessarily negotiate those differences. We just say, well, you're here, so you have to do it my way. And that's just kind of, we want to, improving our cultural capacity is using respectful ways of negotiating these differences without imposing basically our own values. It's asking questions and listening to the answers as opposed to making these assumptions based on a training that you went to that said, Latinos are like this. And it's gathering information on the consumer's interpretation of their culture, because somebody could tell you there's a certain, Latinos are this way. And then when they tell you that's not, I for example, I hear a lot that the Latino culture is very patriarchal. And I literally do not know of any, in my sphere of reference, they're all very matriarchal. They're not patriarchal. I always just say that Latina women are really good at letting the men think that they are in charge. At least that's what my mom taught me. So, so that would be my view, and it's part of my cultural context, and so it wouldn't be helpful to me for somebody to spend a lot of time trying to educate me that I'm wrong. And I'm not to say that I don't find that to be the case. Possibly in some instances, it's just not my experience. Cultural capacity really includes validating strengths and negotiating the acceptance of a different set of values. And this one's really important because it really requires developing linkages and collaborating with culturally specific groups. And I say this because a lot of times people kind of try to do it on their own, and this one becomes important. I like to give the example of there was a shelter one time that was reviewing their policies and practices, for example, and they thought they were fine. And when I looked at them, there were a lot of things that jumped out to me. I'll give you one that if you're not working with people that might be more closely aligned and related to this, you might miss some stuff. In this particular case, and they would not think this was a culturally specific practice, but in this particular case, they had a rule in their manual, their shelter manual, that said you could not burn candles. And that situation had actually happened to me before, where I worked at the shelter and a woman that was of Mexican descent, which is what I am also of, she had come to the shelter, left a horrible relationship, and she asked me if she could light a candle. And I knew that rule was, we had that rule in our policy as well. That rule existed because at some point, somebody had lit a candle and the curtain, lit up, and so then we just ruled out all candles. But when I heard her say that, I was just like, oh, yeah. So I just broke the rule. I was back at a time early in my career when I didn't know how to necessarily advocate to change the rule. I just kind of broke them, and I know a lot of Latinos are probably in this call, and you find yourself doing that. But I basically set it up because what I heard when she asked for that is that's the thing we do to grieve. I know that it was like she had just left this relationship and she needed to grieve, and if I didn't allow her to light her candle and leave, she didn't have to explain this to me, and I don't know that she would have been able to. But I just could, I felt that, and of course I negotiated that, and I figured out a way to do it in a safe way. And that's just an example that I give you, that why it's important to develop these linkages and collaborate with others that will maybe be able to see things in your policies that you might not have been able to think, and help you come up with creative ways to solve those. I just want to point this out. I'm not going to talk much about it, but I do want to talk about this cultural blindness that a lot of times people think, oh, I don't see color, and they think that that's a good thing. But really what you're saying is, no, everybody's like me, and I can just, I can just do things the way I think they would be done, and it will be fine for everybody. And so I want to make sure that a lot of times people understand that genocide was harmful, or that not having lacking the capacity can be destructive, but they don't understand a lot of times how important this aspect of cultural blindness can be. And so I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that for you all as well. This is, we're doing this in partnership with the National Council, and this is, I do believe, a really good checklist. It's actually a little piece in a bigger document that's referenced here at the bottom. But I really like the way they have kind of bulleted these 5 things of checking yourself. Do I have biases and beliefs? Traditional American values aren't necessarily the ones that others have. I really like kind of this And so I wanted to share it with you all so you guys could be able to see that. So that's kind of, sorry I had to take so much time to kind of give you that, you know, the demographics and the kind of foundation that we want you to work with, so that I could really get into the meat then of these of the Latino issues. So the Latinos and child welfare, I actually gave you a whole handout from Casey that I hope you'll look at later, but these are just a few. The first three are off of that handout to just basically talk about. It's interesting because Latinos, up until a few years ago, they were both, it would say that they were kind of, they were, what was it? They were proportionally represented in child welfare, but that's how it looked nationally when you looked at the statistics. But really what happened is in a lot of states they were actually underrepresented, and in a lot of states they were actually overrepresented. And so, and you will see as we start talking about some of the dynamics that occur in these kinds of situations, you will see how and why that's possibly the case, and how it's really detrimental. They're more likely to be placed in out-of-home care. 62% of Latino children served by child welfare are placed in out-of-home care. Now, granted, the other thing that's important about that is 1/3 of those are placed in relative homes, which is higher than any other population, but still it's a very high percentage of children that are put in out-of-home placement. Now, this other issue that Hispanic families are substantially more likely to face an allegation of failure to protect than any other racial group. And that's actually a study that was done by, when I was still at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges in 2008, when we were doing a courts catalyzing change project about achieving equity and fairness in foster care. They did a lot of research and work around that issue, and that came out of that work there. And so that's a really important thing that you will also see as I get into kind of the meat of of Latino cultural values, that you'll see how and why some of these things play out. So I want to talk a little bit now that we have a few general principles around capacity, you know, that we move into this idea of cultural values and concerns and the implications for these in domestic violence and trauma and all that. So basically, respeto refers to the important value of respect for others and for social customs. Latinos may not, for example, how this might play out, Latinos may not express dissatisfaction out of respect. Often clients, you know, you might wonder why they don't return for services without ever discussing, you know, they come once and then they never come back, and they never mentioned any kind of discontent. In child welfare, I've read a lot of different studies where they're asking child welfare workers their perspectives, and they often describe Latinos as being cooperative, which in a lot of ways in child welfare is translated to mean compliant. But workers often express that Latino parents are respectful in their interactions, even when things aren't going their way, which is different to other cultures in many ways, or not all the time. Like I said, we're doing a lot of generalizing here. This is expected and consistent with the value of respeto, as child welfare workers are seen as authority figures by families. But workers may use cooperation as a sign of progress and engagement. They may use the lack of complaints to indicate that the parent-worker relationship is good. However, it's possible that families, as a result of this, are failing to receive the needed services and support because their voices are not heard and they're not encouraged to express any kind of opinions or discontent. Compliance and cooperation may be encouraged at the worker's expediency, but at the cost of listening and advocacy in a way that would kind of foster the values that Latinos need. I'll give you one example of, because I read one particular study where they talked to various women, and she talked about a practice that clashes, for example, with this value that they use in child welfare is unannounced visits. So Latino families may feel that these hinder the parent-child relationship. Parents viewed these visits as a lack of mutual respect, trust, and an invasion of privacy, especially when they are used so inconsistently. So they would have times where some workers they felt were very respectful because they gave them notice when they were coming. They rarely, if ever, would come. When then they would have other workers that did it, you know, real often. and they felt as though they were being spied on more than they were being helped. So I want to go to this concept now of familismo. So familismo focuses on family values and family well-being rather than on individual opportunities. So family members instill within each other values of working for the good of the family unit, even if it's at the expense of individual gratification, which we'll go over super quickly in a little bit, but because it kind of collides with this individualistic kind of more culture that permeates the America as opposed to this collectivist culture in Latin America. Familismo refers to the importance of family closeness, of unity, and getting along with and contributing to the well-being of the family and the whole extended family. This can also involve Latino families valuing and placing a healthy emphasis on older siblings, having some responsibility for helping younger siblings, which in many systems is pathologized as parentification, since it does not align with the Western values that, you know, kids should only be kids. You shouldn't, you know, they shouldn't have to do anything else. And this value is different. This also can possibly lead to this this kind of thing that's happening in the child welfare system in regards to failure to protect. Because of this familismo and the value of that, it's less likely that Latino women are going to leave their relationships, further prompting maybe those failure to protect. There's also, along with this familismo, there's other barriers that kind of come to play as a result of this. There's Latinas have intense loyalty to the extended family. They tend to have a deference to their own needs for family unity and strength. So, you know, like in many cultures, the social it's unacceptable, right? There's a big stigma with divorce. And so these are just other places where Latino values can collide with child welfare. And then this concept of personalismo. Personalismo promotes more intimate interactions between the social service provider and the client as a means of building trust and rapport. However, the lack of quality and frequency in interactions that parents often describe with their workers tends to be consistent with the notion that the child welfare system kind of lacks personalismo for reasons that are a lot of times out of the worker's control. Mothers often want to build relationships with their workers, but they feel that their visits are limited, so they can't ever really be known by the workers. And this concept of they don't know me, she doesn't, you know, how can they know me if they don't spend time? This is a really important kind of concept, because you have to know somebody in order to make really good judgments, in order to know who they are, in order to see how they are with their kids. You can't take a snapshot and know somebody. So that kind of plays into this concept of personalismo. So another place these values collide is that workers expect openness and trust right from the beginning. And this value of personalismo is basically one that it's something that has to be built. Let me go back to my notes here, because now I'm kind of talking off my head. So so it becomes a problem. One of the things that I think we hear talking in American helping services, and so that's another thing that creates kind of a barrier to this idea of personalismo, because you know, you kind of limit what you're willing to share, where in order to build relationships, a lot of times we hear well, they wanted me to tell them all, but they wouldn't say anything to me. You know, like they don't actually establish a relationship. Like, how many kids do you have? Like, there's a mutual thing that happens, that it's a value where you mutually care about each other and show actual engagement in order to build the trust and rapport. So those things do not align. And even when workers attempt a lot of times and they learn these things, and then they engage in acts that are reflective of the needs of Latino families and the value of personalismo, these efforts fall short, because at times their acts are not truly about engagement or truly about providing culturally competent services, but rather about a means to an end. Like, I told them this so that I could get the information I needed. So those are really important concepts to kind of understand. So as a result of kind of a lot of these things, I'm focused right now. I mean, I could do the same thing when talking about domestic violence, which is my background, other than when I was the director of the Child Protection and Custody Resource Center at the council, that it kind of does create this. I'm right now focused on child welfare, but like I said, I don't want it to sound like I'm picking on them. But for them, they're often unable to provide these culturally congruent services in light of organizational policies that do not solicit the feedback and ask families what they need. They don't account for the diverse needs. They have excessive workloads, and they can't operate in the way that they would prefer. And so I said I would go real quickly about this. So I just want to talk about this because this thing about Americans, that a lot of times we don't see the values that we have. And one of the values that really permeates the national culture of America is this concept of individualism. And I'm not saying that these apply across the board in every situation, but you know, a lot of times we may even contradict them, but they're still basically at the heart of our cultural ethos. We see it all the time in a lot of helping services, but I know at shelters, for example, you hear you're trying to help a person who's saying, oh, but this is going on, and I have this, and my aunt lives with me, and we hear you have to take care of yourself first. And we don't think about that is a very individualistic way. And if we're not aware of the fact that that could be one of the reasons why this person left and didn't come back, because they left out going, well, obviously they don't understand. Obviously they don't know. But on another side, sometimes people take that and they're like, they've done it a million times. They're like, oh my God, I'm never going to say you have to take care of yourself first again. And that would be wrong too, because there will probably be a lot of people that can be helped by that, because that is one of their values, and understanding that they see it that way, that they have to take care of themselves first. So it's just an important thing to keep in mind. And I share that with you because the value, a lot of times the Latino value is very much related to collectivism and to interdependence. And, you know, it's not, the survival of the group ensures the well-being of the individual, not the other way around. You know, the harmony and interdependence of the group members. And a lot of times in our culture, because it's not the mainstream way of doing it, the fact that people think this way is another way sometimes that we will kind of pathologize the different values instead of negotiating, more appropriate ways to get the outcomes that we're kind of wanting. Really important to know that we hear a lot of times that that Latino cultures are more violent. It's not true that women are abused at the same rate of other races. Violence is not normal in certain groups, and not in the Latino group. Men in every culture have a way of subjugating women, and cultural differences need to be considered when dealing with domestic violence. These are just kind of some principles, but they must never be used to deny or excuse the violence. They just have to work from inside the culture. Culture is centered to how a battered woman organizes her experience, and in this case, I'm talking about Latinas, but this really applies to a lot of women of different cultural backgrounds, that it's going to influence how she seeks assistance. We've kind of learned that as we talked about all of these examples. It's going to influence what she defines as the problem as opposed to what you think is the problem. It's going to influence her attitude about sharing the problems, about her expectations for what should happen, for what she needs versus what it is you think that she needs. It influences what she understands as the causes of the problem. A lot of times, we spend a lot of time trying to get them to accept that the cause is what alcohol is a good one. If they think if they want him to stop drinking because that's the only time it happens. And we spend a lot of time and energy focused on, educating her that it has nothing to do with that. When, we have to figure out a way to negotiate those differences. It influences the number of stressors she's exposed to as a result of all of these oppressions that we kind of talked about, and how she, how she views whether she can be helped or not, because a lot of times she has reached out for help many, many times, and it hasn't gone well for her. So I leave you, I believe, actually I have one more slide after this, but I leave you with this. I really love this quote. It's, we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. And I kind of, that's one of the takeaways for me in this, because that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to that I think in this real quick way that we're trying to kind of give you all of these little pieces to kind of set up the problem so that you can see the problem may not be what you think it is, because it has a lot to do. So before I turn it over to Heidi, I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of general, because I want you to have in the way that I kind of presented this, there's a few things that are left off, but I want you to know that there are other concerns besides those kind of specific examples that I brought up. There's personal barriers that we didn't touch on that are related to religious beliefs, and that Latinos are concentrated in low-paying jobs. There's a lot of places do not have language access plans and ways to meet the needs. There's immigration issues that prevent them from seeking help sometimes, or they go to shelters and there's nobody there that even speaks Spanish. There's no food there that they eat, and those are microcosms. But I mean, those are really important personal barriers that we need to be aware of as we talk about these issues. There's also, we've seen this is playing out all over our country, systemic biases in the delivery of services. There's a real mistrust, a valid mistrust of mainstream formal systems. And there's an underrepresentation of people of color among service providers and in position of leadership. So you have people that, in a way, they say can't really know you completely. And then formal systems that don't include relevant, or I mean, we have men who are, for example, who are sent to programs who don't speak English, who are sent to English programs because there isn't one, and it's kind of irrelevant that he can't understand what's happening. He just has to be there. And so I leave you with that, and with that, I turn it over to Heidi.
Hi, everyone, and it's great being here. Before I move into the next piece that is looking at trauma-specific or trauma-informed approaches, I wanted to address quickly a couple of comments that have been posted. And I know that we said that we would take questions at the end. But I think it's important to list some of those comments, and hopefully, of course, we'll continue this communication even beyond this webinar. I wanted to highlight again that, as Ruby said earlier, we are making generalizations. There is the only way to actually address this topic today, and there was a word of caution given at the beginning to really avoid making huge generalizations about entire cultural groups. I think the note about familismo and respeto and those cultural values are because we've seen the emphasis that and the impact that they play on Latino families and survivors of violence, specifically in the context of family violence. So we're not saying that these values are not present in other cultural groups, but we're saying that they play a tremendous role on Latino families. So that was the point of raising those. There was also a comment made earlier about language, and there was a question about why are we not referring to people that are undocumented as illegal, and that's a position that we've taken as we do this work for social justice. So we believe that there is no human being that's illegal, and the term illegal alien is a term that's used by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but it's not one that we utilize. So I think that's really important for all of us to be aware of and mindful of, especially when we're interacting with other people. So those are the two comments I had before I move into the next piece about this whole idea of trauma-informed care and highlighting the differences between trauma-specific interventions and trauma-informed care, because a lot of us doing this work are under a lot of pressure, and some of us are seeing these ideas of trauma-informed care as new concepts, when in reality they are not new concepts, they just have this terminology. So I want to take a moment to highlight those differences, to start this piece about, so why, after we are hearing all of these things about culture, why are those important when we are providing services and support that are trauma-informed? So what's the difference between trauma-specific interventions and services, trauma-informed care, and trauma-informed approaches? So what is the difference? And so I'm also wanting to do this because sometimes as advocates we hear, for those of us in the group today that are advocates, we hear that, oh, trauma-informed care, the word trauma, we are not therapists, we're not counselors, so that's not for me to do, right? That's for someone else. So trauma-informed approaches really refers to the understanding of the prevalence of trauma. So in many instances, is to treat traumatic events or experiences as in the same manner that we wash our hands to prevent the spread of diseases, so using universal precautions. So it's really to understand the prevalence of trauma when we're talking or working with entire groups of individuals and communities. So assuming that perhaps it's there. Also understanding how it affects all individuals involved with our services or systems. And also that we respond, so the strategies that we use to respond to traumatic events and people experiencing and surviving traumatic experiences are actually shaped by this knowledge that we have. Trauma-informed approaches avoid re-traumatizing people that are seeking support. They really focus on safety first, pay a lot of attention to doing no harm, and facilitates participation and meaningful involvement of survivors and families in the planning of services and programs. So it's really connection between ourselves and those who are coming to seek our support. Also that it requires close collaborative relationships with other systems. So we see in here the importance of working together. And one of the things that I find very exciting about today's webinar is that I see many of you coming from different fields joining this discussion. Trauma-informed care then refers to, it's very similar to the approach, but we say trauma-informed care in situations of sectors that, don't identify as caregiving. So sometimes the criminal and juvenile justice system, and they could practice within their systems trauma-informed approaches or care, right? But they don't think of themselves as caregiving. Trauma-informed care may still be used in such systems as primary and behavioral health care or child welfare, but the definition of that, or what's put out there by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, recognizes that the term trauma-informed approach is more applicable across a broad range of systems. So we talk a lot about trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed care interchangeably, and I just wanted to make that clear. In contrast, I wanted to move to this, actually I was missing a slide, but trauma-specific interventions, which is a slide that I don't have here, actually refers to those interventions that need to occur and happen by a trained professional. So things that are done by a mental health professional, and those are trauma-specific interventions. And I think it's important to understand the difference. That is not what advocates are called to do. So what do we mean by trauma-informed approaches, and what have we learned working with culturally specific organizations and in our role as a culturally specific resource center? What does that mean in the terms of a philosophical framework, if you will? So in there, we, after much observation, were able to come up with a number of principles that define what we mean by trauma-informed approaches. So one of them is the awareness of the origin of trauma. So remember earlier on we were talking about really understanding and treating these traumatic experiences and assuming that either they were there, but also becoming very familiar with the causes of those experiences. So this is part of, this trauma-informed approaches ties into what Ruby was saying when she was talking about cultural capacity. So the way in which we respond to the experiences of trauma survivors are really critical, right? And if we are unaware or lack understanding of their histories, these pieces around their histories of trauma, we really miss those connections. So the other piece is the relationships that we built. And a moment ago we heard about the importance of establishing these relationships based on mutuality and respect, and the tremendous emphasis that those connections may have when we're working with survivors of violence in any system. Also, there is a piece around fluidity, where organizations and survivors are learning from one another, and that really speaks to eliminating or minimizing as much as possible these hierarchical connections that sometimes happen where practitioners are in this higher place of knowledge and wisdom and places the survivor, those seeking services that are left at a lower level. So really to make those equal, if you will, and recognizing that both have a very important role in that relationship. The importance of humility, which is the ongoing process of self-reflection. And we heard that earlier too, as part of our cultural capacity, is to really be able to understand our biases and to have this process for constantly reflecting on where privilege is, where we're missing or misunderstanding what's happening around us because of our biases. As I said earlier, it's really important to know the communities in which we work. The cultural capacity, or what some people refer to as cultural competence, doesn't really mean that you have to know everything there is to know about a cultural group. And that was mentioned earlier as well. But we do have a responsibility with with those that we're working with. And we have the responsibility to really understand where they're coming from, really know their characteristics and what they're dealing with. So at least to know who are the groups in our community that we are going to interact the most. So it's not to mean that you have to know everything there is to know about every culture. The other piece has to do with being really this change that we want to see in the world, right? Like that saying, so not to expect others to do what we're not prepared to do. And if we have practices in place that are unintentionally oppressing others, and sometimes that shows up in the way of shelter rules, for example, and Ruby talked about a situation in which she broke the rule. Sometimes it takes a lot of, goes back to this process of self-reflection to take a look at our practices and see what are we doing that actually diminishes people's agency or ability to make decisions and make changes. And to remember, too, that in the context of violence, our role is to restore autonomy and safety. So that's a really important piece. And the last piece is this awareness of the tremendous diversity within our communities. We haven't said much yet about the presence of indigenous communities within the Latino communities, because we're making, as we said earlier, generalizations here, but within Latino communities, there is also a tremendous presence of indigenous communities that do not speak Spanish as their first language. So to really assume that all Latinos speak Spanish, right, and those kind of things sometimes is more dangerous than helpful in working with our community. So I think I wanted to highlight that piece as well. So these are the principles that we've come up with working with others and in our experience. Trauma. So basically, it's an emotional response to a terrible event. It doesn't mean that it's an abnormal reaction. A lot of times it's very normal. When it becomes complex, it's when the symptoms persist for a long time. And then we see in those cases post-traumatic stress disorder, and we know of it, we see that a lot with veterans, for example, sometimes with domestic violence survivors, human trafficking survivors, and so forth. And there is also the case of complex trauma. So it's really the exposure to multiple or prolonged traumatic events. So in this case, we can see it in some adults who are exposed to violence as children for many phases of their lives. So it's really this prolonged exposure to traumatic events. But what is it and where do I want to spend some time today is to really think about it as it affects, or it can affect, every sphere of a person's life. So it can affect our mental well-being, our spiritual, our physical, our emotional. So it really can have manifestations all over our bodies and minds. But today I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about collective trauma, which is something that still in the literature there isn't enough information about this type of trauma There is some, but it's not us. There is not a lot of writing about this still today. When we are talking about the experiences that many or large groups of individuals under specific groups experience, like economic hardship, social problems, and responses by systems like racism, poverty, anti-immigrant sentiments and laws. And that over time can have tremendous impact and can be very traumatic. So why is that important in our work? It's very important because not only for the survivors of violence that we work with, but a lot of times ourselves doing this work, we are also exposed to some of these events and environments. So we ourselves doing this work can also be experiencing this collective trauma, and that has tremendous impact on what we do. And here I wanted to list examples of what I'm talking about. So it could be community violence, oppression, discrimination, stigma, institutional trauma. So sometimes too, it's violence that it happens, that occurs at the hands of institutions that are there to protect. It's also about, it can be passed on from generation to generation. And we've heard the term historical trauma to illustrate this, and how it actually changes people, and for years, for generation over generation. So it really has tremendous long-lasting impact. We don't have time to get into what other examples do we have, because we're trying to do this very quickly. But from there, I wanted to move to talk about intersectionality. And I think intersectionality is a term that we all hear about, and some of us that went to school and concentrated on things like sociology and so forth, we really are very familiar with the term. So what does that mean in our work, in our daily work? So it really means to take into account the entire humanity of the person that's in front of us. And that includes ourselves in this process. So I was trying to find a good image that would show all of these dimensions of a person's identity. And this one was helpful because it really listed a lot of these dimensions. It doesn't mean by any means that it encompasses everything. For example, it says sexuality, but it doesn't say gender expression. It talks about it, but it lists other things, right, like race, ethnicity, religion, language, heritage and history, immigration status, and so forth. So I think all of these dimensions could have an impact on a person's experiences of our systems, our efforts to help and support, and how we work with each other. Also to highlight that all oppression is connected, and that it really is impossible to separate whether I'm being discriminated against because I'm Cuban, or because I'm a lesbian, or because I have a disability, or because, so all of these dimensions of a person, or because I lack access to education and so forth, can have an impact, and they're all interconnected. So I wanted to take a moment and bring Audre Lorde to this space, because this is something, again, that we hear a lot about, but we tend to design our services and responses to violence in a very fragmented way. So really, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And that sounds like, of course, right? We all know that. But we still tend to either try to go the route of, oh, I need to know everything there is to know about a particular cultural group, or now I'm culturally competent to work with this group but not that group. And by doing that, we're really not understanding that people have different dimensions to their identities, and we really have to work with the entire humanity of the person. We know, and we know the concept, trauma, and the co-occurring issues, right, that we see in trauma, and we know we've seen this many times. We also know that even in the context of violence, very rarely we work with somebody who has experienced only one and one only form of violence. But historically, our services and funding have been divided, and things are really separate, or have been kept very separate. So that sometimes causes problems when we're working with a survivor who perhaps experienced sexual violence in the context of domestic violence. If we do fail to understand the complexity of these traumatic experiences, and if we do fail to look at people and cultures based on their strengths, we could remind people of their traumatic experiences. We could increase, or we could see an increase in unhealthy coping. We could see an increase in relapse to substance use or other mental health issues. We could see withdrawal from relationships. So it's really important to think about the cost of not doing our work in a trauma-informed work. So when I think about what is the cost of, for example, not providing language access, right? What is the cost of perhaps saying that somebody is failing at protecting their child because of something that maybe, going back to this idea of familismo and seeing children as the parentified child and so forth, where is that coming from? And I know that a lot of times we don't have a lot of time to pause and look at things entirely. What do we know about culturally specific communities? What have we learned in our work? We know that historically they have not had access to individual services or mainstream services as we know them. We know that historical trauma may also include abuse by medical professionals and other institutions. We know that collective trauma may include non-traditional events, as I was saying earlier, like poverty, discrimination, racism, unjust immigration laws. Sometimes we can see the tremendous pressure impact that just the media could have on entire groups of individuals. Just the way, for example, that Latina women are portrayed in the media, that actually takes a toll on many of us. But we also know that culturally specific communities have collectively done things to buffer the effects of trauma. We know that cultural traditions, strong cultural identities, cultural stories have really helped deal with this trauma. We know that the communities themselves can provide healing through these individual strengths, through sharing their collective knowledge and wisdom. And here is how a lot of these could tie into our conversation earlier. A lot of times when we think about our cultural capacity and thinking about what we ourselves personally may not know, how is it that we are eliciting feedback? How is it that we are working with communities based on their strengths, on their own wisdom, on their knowledge? And I think a lot of times there isn't a lot of attention paid to having a process in place for engaging the communities in which we work to get this kind of feedback and to doing this work actually collaboratively. So what can we all do? What can we all do to increase our cultural capacity and to respond to violence in trauma-informed ways? So we just have a list of recommendations that, of course, is by no means all-inclusive. This is based on our experiences so far, and we invite you to also send your recommendations. So, oops, I went too fast. So is that we really respond in all structural domains, right? We pay attention to values and attitudes. Our values, our attitudes, even when it's difficult to have those conversations, to really have a process for self-reflection. This is really important. Understanding ourselves, examining the mission and culture of our organization. Is it safe to deal with these issues? Do we have the space to actually raise this problem? And to understand that changing values and cultures can be a lengthy and difficult process, but not impossible. Also, that we pay attention to communication styles. So these really also include behaviors and attitudes toward individuals of different languages and cultures, and the sensitivity that we use when communicating with people. For example, making the assumption that deaf individuals all read lips. That's a very common practice that happens, and it really limits the ability to communicate with deaf individuals. Reading lips is actually a skill that not everyone has. So I think that shows a way of making assumptions about an entire cultural group. And I would invite all of you to try it. Reading lips is very, very complicated. That we also involve the community in this process to participate, and I was saying that earlier, but this also includes to who is on our board, that we are intentional about who sits on our board, that we're intentional about having diverse teams doing this work, that the participants accessing our programs are have a say in what we're doing and have a mechanism for providing feedback. Also, the pieces around the physical environment, materials, and resources available, that they are linguistically responsive, that they are accessible to the largest group of individuals, that they're at a level that is also accessible in terms of literacy to a large group of individuals, that we offer things in a variety of formats. Policies and procedures includes written policies, procedures, mission statements, goals, objectives that incorporate cultural and linguistic principles and practices, including hiring multicultural and multilingual staff. That's really important, and that people are compensated accordingly. That this is really intentional. So when I hear a lot of times, we're trying to hire a Latina, but nobody applies. So really to be intentional about where are we placing those ads? Who are we asking to help us share the information? That the things that we are doing are population-based practice, program development and services, or meet those. So what does that mean? That the practice that avoids the misapplication of scientific knowledge. This is really, really important. We deal with this often at the National Latino Network. Things that reinforce stereotype about groups. So we find ourselves a lot of time trying to dispel or dismantle some of these ideas that are out there. And sometimes, well, it comes from science. So we really spend a lot of time doing that. Also, the area of training and professional development, and that includes requirements and opportunities for cultural competence training there, so that institutionalize these piece. So this is an area that you know you're going to expect, and it's an area that is really looked at as important. So we also have a list here of action steps. And the fact that many of you go back to your organizations and perhaps you don't have all the power to make changes right away, right? So what we've learned in our experience is that buy-in can happen, but it usually happens with a committee when you have a group of people that represent all levels of the organization working together. So it doesn't mean that you have to bring every single person to do it, but it is important that you have a group that represents the organization that you're part of, and that they develop, they work and commit to these pieces. So in here we have ideas for developing support for change. So throughout the organization and the community, it's important to know who is in your community, as I said earlier. So to really learn what their history, their cultural traditions and norms are. To identify the barriers for working with people in the community. And finding solutions. And here I was listing the promotores approach, and I don't know if all of you are familiar with this, but really started in Latin America, and what it is the community members that become trained, and when it started, it was really in the healthcare setting. But here there were community members that were trained to train other community members on specific things about healthcare, and because they acted as ambassadors, and there were people from within communities going from home to home, the promoters have been tremendously successful. It's also been used in the U.S. context for many things, including domestic violence education. And it's one of those culturally specific approaches that works very well because it really engages the community. Also to have a system for assessing periodically the level of cultural competence in your organization. Remember that it's a process or a journey. This is not a destination, and that's why we were saying earlier that the term competence is one that we try not to use, and we refer to it as capacity. Sometimes we talk about being culturally responsive. Also, that you identify the leadership and the resources that are needed to make changes. There are goals, that you develop goals and implement steps and deadlines for achieving them. Very important. I think a lot of times we talk about wanting to do things, but without a plan, we're all too busy and things don't happen. That you also implement an evaluation process, that you're measuring outcomes, looking at what you have changed, what you have achieved, right? And having mechanisms to increase your organization's capacity, promote relationships with your constituents based on what we said earlier, mutuality and respect, and having these options, viable options for soliciting feedback from community members about the work of your organization. You can ask, how are we doing? What could we do differently? And always, always that you promote this intersectional analysis into your work. So I have to apologize because I'm going through this very quickly. But with this, I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll just turn it over to our host. Thank you.
I'm not sure. This is Ruby again. Maybe if Sarah or Alicia can let us know what the process is for taking questions, if we have any.
Hi, Ruby, and to the participants, if you have a question, just type it into the chat box.
Okay.
Or a comment. Can you see the chat box, Ruby and Heidi?
Yes, we can see the chat box.
And it's just, I think the last time I looked at it, I think it was just some discussion amongst the participants. But if there's something you'd like to, some kind of comment you'd like to make, just.
Okay, so right now, Heidi, there's a question about, can you talk a little bit more about what constitutes intersectionality, to do intersectional analysis into your work? Can you talk more about what that means?
Right. So in there, so the list of ideas that I was giving earlier, the suggestions, the action steps, are really all geared towards, as I said earlier, working with the entire person, right? The individual experience. So that basically means that if you're working with a Latino community or whomever it is, that you really have practices in place that honor language, that honor these histories of trauma that I mentioned before, that your policies and procedures are such that really are geared towards minimizing trauma, that or trauma triggers, that sort of thing, that you're really not fragmenting your services, which I think tends to happen quite a bit, like where I'm only working with you because of your sexual assault experience, but to really understand that all of these things are interconnected, and perhaps sometimes when we're working with survivors of violence who may also experience high levels of poverty or tremendous fear when it comes to the legal system, for example, that perhaps they may be more cautious and not necessarily uncooperative. Overall, really, that your policies and practice and procedures are there to avoid, as I said earlier, re-traumatization, but also that you keep your assumptions in check. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I can add one other thing about this, when we do, because a lot of times that is another one of those things where we say, oh, we have to use intersectionality, and I think, I gave this example before in a different presentation that I did when we were talking about this. I had used the term a lot of times people understand it better when you ask them to use a multi-layered approach right from the start. And so as an example of this, because we tend to basically have universal goals, right? So as an example, a universal goal might be that all children should have access to a pleasurable and meaningful education, right? So, and if you're just kind of using mainstream thinking, your strategies might evolve from that. And so you may focus your resources and supports to cultivate, retain, and nurture good teachers and administrators. You might create specialized curriculums. You might have increased standards that you think, those that'll help middle-class children of all races. But if you want to reach, if you think about intersectionality and how people's lives and kind of working at the margins, if you want to reach low socioeconomic status children, then in addition to those things that you're doing, you're also going to want to add nutritious meals, stable housing, and access to health care to the list of core strategies that you're going to kind of be pushing and advocating for. If you want to reach African American and Latino children, the list maybe is then going to include curriculums that teach relevant histories and counter the unconscious impact of pervasive negative stereotypes. If you want to also reach recent immigrant children and limited English proficiency children in the margins, then what how you're going to look at it intersectionally is that now you're going to include resources that cultivate and retain good teachers, that have specialized curriculums, that give meals, that teach relevant histories and minimize stereotyping, and that have English language supports, first language supports and interpretation. So then you're basically, working intersectionally means that you continue this process until you get to those kind of most marginalized, and that becomes your starting place, as opposed to the other way around where you do something that works for everyone and you kind of keep piecemealing things in there. That's another way to kind of look at it that might be helpful.
That's a great point, Ruby. I think what we see sometimes too is that people see I guess what's not the normal, the U.S. mainstream way, as when we're going to work with a traditionally underserved or marginalized group, it usually happens too because, there is a new grant or a new project. So that sees that or puts people in a separate box. So something we get to when we have the opportunity. And I think that's what you're saying, of to start from there rather than the other way around. So it involves changing attitudes. It really is. I see that Ilda has a question about the impact of an organization that's about 30 years old or more. The board of directors does not have a Latino board member. How do you suggest this be requested?
You know what? I would actually ask Hilda if it's possible for us to actually do a little one-on-one consultation, because this is actually, I can't do this in 4 minutes, but I actually I'm a Latina that has been on a lot of boards. And I might, if we could have a discussion, that might be a better way to kind of handle this problem. So if somehow we'll figure out how to get your information. I'll find out from Sarah how to do that. So there's a question here. Christine was saying that she wants to go over the percentages of children that were discussed in the beginning. I'm not sure if I can add more to that, but we might need a little bit more clarity about what you'd like there. All of those percentages that actually they should all be in the slide of the PDF that we created. However, because we're running short on time, I want also everybody to know that you can also reach out to us at Casa de Esperanza directly. If you want us to do more work with your organization, if you want to discuss some of the concepts, if you want to put together, a lot of times we'll have organizations that call us to put together, they want us to talk to maybe their staff. Like I said, we do operate the resource center that does this particular kind of work. And we'll work with you to kind of figure out ways that we can give you like individualized attention. The slide was only missing in the one we had here, but it's not missing in the PDF that you all have. All right. All right. Thank you. All right. So we're down to 2 minutes here. Any last words, Heidi?
No, I unfortunately couldn't fully participate in the exchange that I saw earlier between a lot of you about the term illegal and so forth. I invite everyone to continue that conversation and to, as Ruby said, reach out to us directly. I couldn't do two things at the same time, but I think as somebody noted, that is a very complex issue, and in our cases, as I said, we had taken a position about that we stand by. So let's feel free to reach out to us. I think our contact information should be included as part of what goes out, I'm guessing. So we'll keep this line of communication open. Thank you for having us.
All right. Yeah, and I want to thank everyone. These are like really, really, really hard discussions, and the fact that you're willing to take time out of your day to do it. We apologize for throwing so much at you in such a short time, but we really wanted to cover so much. It's kind of give you a teaser of all the kind of different points that are important. So I want you to know how much we appreciate your time in joining us. Sarah?
And we really appreciate both of you for beginning this conversation, and we really hope that the Resource Center can continue to hold webinars on this theme, and we'd love to have you back again to dig a little deeper into the issue. We really want to thank all of you for joining us. Please do fill out the survey. Let us know so we can get a sense of what worked and what didn't for you as well, and that should be popping up on your screen now. If you don't see it pop up, just click on the survey link. And in the Ruby, do you have your emails addresses in the PowerPoint? Do you recall?
I don't believe we do.
I don't think so. Maybe if we put them.
Why don't you
we just put them on the chat?
Yeah, put your email addresses in the chat box, just so that you have them, so that they're there. Okay. And those of you, if you have any questions or need to get those emails, if you somehow didn't get them during this session, you can certainly email me or the Resource Center. Thank you very much to Ruby and Heidi and to all the participants.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.